All right. Thanks everyone for joining us. I don't have anybody new in the waiting room yet. Oh, a couple of people trickling in. I'll just give everybody one more minute to arrive over from their last session. You're here in the Impact Navigator room with us. We're gonna speak about the impact measurement framework and digital tool project that Headstream's been working on since September. We're gonna have a chance to dig into it and show you how it works in just a couple of moments. So thanks for being here. Would love to see any introductions in the chat. If you want to just share your name, where you're zooming in from, what organization you're representing, just hear who's in our virtual room together. Hi, Patricia, thanks for being here. Hi, Kendra, glad to have you. All right, I think I'll get started because we do have a short time together, and I'll just thank you guys all in advance for bearing with me. I am both manning our Zoom, the recording, the slides, the chat, and presenting to you. So I might be toggling back and forth through some screens, and I appreciate your grace with me as we probably will inevitably hit some technical snags, but we'll take it as we go. So I'm really looking forward to jumping into this with you. Let's get started, and I'll keep an eye on the room as more folks are coming in. So welcome. We are here together to talk about impact measurement. I'm going to start really quickly by introducing myself. I'm Megan Lillis. I came to Headstream last year to manage this awesome project alongside my teammates, Dr. Scotty Cash, Solomé Tibabu, and Stuart Gill from Second Muse. Dr. Scotty Cash is our research advisor, and she is in the Zoom room today. So shout outs to Scotty. Thanks so much for being here. And Scotty's also going to help me out by keeping an eye on the chat. So please drop in with your questions and comments there. Scotty will be able to respond to most of them, and also will be able to ping me and make sure we address things as they come up. So just to set some context, I am zooming in from the Bay Area. It's sunny and beautiful here today. And what brought me into this session is kind of a winding road through social entrepreneurship, social innovation, and community development work that illuminated this quite nerdy passion I have for impact measurement. And where that came from is discovering along the way that supporting entrepreneurs in this space, especially leaders from underrepresented identities who are designing for really complex social and environmental challenges, that they're really held back by not having the evidence to support their argument and their case for financing, for support, for innovation. And I'm really dedicated to empowering those leaders to build an evidence-based argument so they can take credit for their impact goals and progress their work and achieve their missions. So that's really what impact measurement is all about, and what Impact Navigator, the tool we've built, sets out to do. So I'm really excited to show it to you. In full candor, in the spirit of all things Headstream, I was really nervous to give a presentation at last year's Innovation Festival because we mostly had a lot of questions and a really big challenge in front of us. And I'm still a little nervous, but much more excited this year because we have something real to show you. We've really figured out something that's practical and implementable, and quite flexible to meet the needs of a lot of different folks with different experience levels around doing social research, designing social experiments, and doing evaluation work. So that'll be the main focus of our time here together, is really empowering you all with understanding how this works and how you might be able to put it into practice. And again, in the spirit and ethos of all things Headstream, we really want to invite your ideas, invite your questions, invite your feedback. I really encourage you to jump into the chat, to raise your hand, to ping us. I'm really more than happy to pause my presentation at any point so we can have a dialogue and we can hash these things out. Me talking into the Zoom void only gets us so far. So please don't be shy. And the way our session is going to work is I'll tell you a little bit about how we got here. I know there's a lot of familiar faces in the room who know a bit about our project, so we'll keep that really high level. And then the meat of the session is going to be digging into the Impact Nav digital tool. This is live. This is a website that's up. It's free to use. It's a public utility. So my goal for demoing it with you today is to be able to empower you to go off and use it. Then we'll come back to the presentation and I'll show you a little bit of the science behind the tool. And I'm hoping Scotty will lend some of her ideas there because she's really the architectural mastermind behind linking the social science into the practical framework we have. And then my real goal is to give us lots of breathing room and space as a community towards the end of this session to hear your questions and discuss a little bit about how you might imagine using Impact Navigator as a tool and any changes you'd like to see or ideas you have about how we can improve it and build it out, since that's where we're heading with this. Before I jump into it, do we have any questions on how today is going to go? Fabulous. Thanks everyone for continuing to introduce yourselves in the chat. Bring your questions there and we'll just keep this rolling. Awesome. So I want to just ground us first in setting the context of where this project began. I know some of you have been privy to this conversation and might have even been at our session at last year's Innovation Festival in September. We spent some time there discussing the broader challenges and functions of impact measurement. And I shared a lot of my ideas about how, in order to be able to measure something, we need to first understand what it looks like. So I want to pose this question to you all, which is, what does impacting youth well-being mean to you? I'm just going to let that sit for 15, 20 seconds. What does that really look like, especially when we're in digital places? How can you tell if well-being is happening? What does it take to impact well-being? Maybe drop an idea in the chats. And I also would love to hear even reflections about what answering this question brings up for you. As you probably are feeling, and I know from the questions in the chat and the answers here, it's a really hard thing to answer this question. It's qualitative, it's subjective, and each of us as individuals will have a different reaction to those terms, to that language, from our own lived experience. We define well-being in so many complex and different ways. We hear this from innovators all the time as well. They know that what they're building is valuable because young people are asking for these products, are using them, are sharing them, and they know intuitively that they're contributing to people's well-being. But it really is complex to name exactly why and in what ways. For example, one innovator shared with us that what makes impact measurement so hard for their work and their startup is that their innovation is really rooted in human intangibles. Great performance for them looks like changes in a greater sense of self, in having more positive experiences, in building deeper relationships. in fostering a calmer sense of belonging. And it can really make your head hurt trying to quantify these qualitative elements. And this underscores some of the other challenges that result of not having that shared definition when it comes to impact measurement. So we see this in the field like inconsistent language or different terminology. Different stakeholders have different functions for doing measurement, and that might drive a different take on definition. They might have different expectations about how deep that definition should go. They might have limited capacity to do research around this. So in our design process, we kept coming back to the truth that we first needed to establish shared definitions. We can't measure youth well-being if we're all thinking about something different when we think about youth well-being. And this was the essential first step in order to support Headstream startups and other players in this ecosystem to better understand, track, quantify, report, and ultimately learn from their social effects. Yeah, Amanda, I love your comment here in the chat, which is how are you defining well-being? That's really the takeaway here. So what we did is we really tried to first understand how this challenge plays out in the ecosystem today. We know innovators and folks who are creating new experiences and products are great at describing their work in their own language, which is about value propositions and business objectives. So we linked arms with Digital Delta, who some of you might have been in their session just before this, because they were already going to the crowd to articulate these dimensions of youth well-being in natural language that reflected young people and their communities. So exactly with that question of how are you defining well-being, we said, well, how do people define it for themselves? And so Digital Delta gave us a really essential component in the Lego building blocks of creating an impact measurement framework. So then we went to the other side of the coin and we said, well, how do researchers do this? Because academic social science researchers are also great at talking about well-being, but in their language of complex terminology, academic words, and kind of technical devices. So ultimately, we knew that our impact measurement tool needed to be a translator. It needed to first create a common language for everybody to be talking in, and then create a GPS so that people could find their right place in that language and kind of take what they needed from that. And for us, that's what the metrics are. So in order to build this, we spent 3 months, it felt like 3 years, 3 months in deep research mode, going to entrepreneurs, investors, systems leaders, and community stakeholders to really understand their needs, understand their definitions, and understand their purpose in measuring their impact. Then we designed a framework to translate these two, and those create metrics, which are indicators that both science and entrepreneurs can agree give us meaningful evidence that youth well-being is occurring. And those metrics are all framed in the language of research. And you'll have a chance to see what those actually look like when I demo the tool in just a few moments. So ultimately, I think it's important to call out that the long-term vision for this shared language is what Impact Navigator's mission is really about, which is that this shared common language can also meaningfully bring along other stakeholders too, because this conversation isn't only happening between academics and entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs and funders. This is also happening with philanthropic funders and with community leaders and institutions like educators, healthcare systems, and caregivers like parents who might be trying to understand the right innovations for the young people in their lives. Like I said, that's essentially what Headstream's interest is in building this framework and building this tool, is understanding that overall effect the shared language can have on the youth wellbeing ecosystem. because when these conversations are organized and we can agree on these shared indicators of progress and success, then we can start driving innovators to focus on the areas that are most in need. We can also point investors with resources to back those innovations that are making concrete impacts. And we can also point systems like education and hospitals to identify solutions that fit their specific needs. Ultimately, these are all interconnected. So our vision is that when more and more of these solutions are being built, financed, and utilized in this way that's organized around a shared understanding of progress and trackable ways of knowing it's occurring, then we can best position ourselves to collectively achieve our mission together and do the best we can for young people. So that's my little bit of a design primer on how we got to the version of the tool you're about to see. There were so many things we could have built that this is kind of a lens to understand why the tool looks the way it does and does this process of guiding to metrics rather than creating a data analytics platform. I threw a lot of information at you, and I'm also going to take a moment to toggle to the tool itself so we can go into the demo. So I'll just pause here for any reflections or questions you guys have about what you're about to see. Anything coming up for you? Awesome. We'll just jump into it then. I'm sure you're itching to understand what I'm actually describing when I talk about the tool and the demo. I know I'm always hungry to jump to this part. So let's get into it. Scotty, is everybody seeing Impact Navigator now? Okay, great. Thanks. So this is the tool. You can find it at impactnav.org. Again, like I said, this is a live site. You're welcome to use it in its current form, and it is in beta. That's an important note because we stood this up really quickly, and it's designed to be functional and create a lot of learnings for us and lessons. So you'll see some things, and we really welcome your comments and your feedback about how to improve the look and feel and the technicalities of it. There's a feedback bubble throughout. So when you come to Impact Navigator, you'll see really who we are aiming to serve with Impact Navigator. We've created really a version for startups and then another version for folks outside of that space. We tell you a little bit about what brought you there and the features of it. And so what we'll do together today is go through the startup view, which is the way to customize metrics. The other two views with these blue bubbles, you can explore the entire framework and kind of see the different ways it connects. But let's show you really that navigation process, which is in the startup lens. I'll also say we invite nonprofits, established companies, anybody who is trying to customize their impact KPIs to come through this startup door. So just know that startup is kind of the catch-all term for that. Great. So the first step in Impact Navigator is also the same first step in a theory of change process, which some of you also might be familiar with, which is really understanding what activities are you up to. And in this view, these are also about getting to the common language. So this step invites the user to think about which aspects of youth well-being are you addressing, are you targeting? And these draw from Digital Delta. So folks who have dug into that tool or attended that session might recognize some of these aspects as factors. These are root factors that came from the crowd around how young people and their communities define their well-being. So in this view, you would think about this as, yes, my innovation is trying to change the access youth have to trusted information about mental, physical, sexual health and development. It's a bit of a brain teaser, right? But There's 85 and growing different dimensions here of youth well-being, organized into 7 categories, which are access to resources, connection and relationships, perspective of the world, self-care, reasoning and judgment, sense of self, and personal skills. So this might take anywhere from a quick scan to a thoughtful half an hour exercise amongst a team to complete in a meaningful way. But really what we hope is that it helps to have something to react to when you're thinking about what are my impact goals, just like we had when we thought about that question of what does impacting youth well-being mean to you? It's hard to pull it out of thin air, right? So the idea with this first step is to have some prompts, something to react to, something to browse through. So I've gone ahead and selected a couple of these for the purposes of the demo. And I've also noticed, which is another thing we're still testing and we would love your data about, that folks do tend to choose a lot of these, especially people who are working on an innovation, right? You're really passionate about addressing youth well-being. And so a lot of these are going to ring true. And so this demo has selected 5 activities, but you might end up choosing many more than that, which is what we address in the next step, which is to say, let's look at all of your yeses and really think about which ones do you have to address in order for people to get value from your innovation, from your product. And so this is another exercise around prioritization and thinking about first and second order or direct and indirect impacts. So you might think, yeah, my innovation is trying to change the ability youth have to find like-minded people, but ultimately we do that by building their assessment of genuine and trusted friendships. So that needs to be the main thing that we focus on. So this exercise, again, can be a valuable one in refining and prioritizing and getting clear on where you're adding value. And this, again, is an important step in the impact measurement process. So we'll say I'm done prioritizing. And then in this stage, we're really looking to understand a little bit more about the user, where they're coming from, what kind of technology they're building or product or intervention, and then, you know, kind of where they're structurally designed, how much scale they're currently at, and what populations they're focused on. So the reason we ask these questions is because we can begin to see patterns in the ecosystem, right? Maybe organizations are grouped in interesting ways and ed tech companies are clustering around a certain impact goal, or organizations of a certain size are doing something else. We can find gaps, we can find clusters, and then we can feed that information, you know, into the hands of community leaders and then also into things like Headstream programming. Excuse me. I'm going to pause and check the chat here. I see a couple of things. Awesome. Thanks, Scotty, for dropping my email in. Perfect. So once you fill on this screen, which I'm not going to bore you guys through me filling this out, I'll just show you what comes next, which is what we call the dashboard. So this dashboard's your logged in state. We have folks create a password just so you can save your answers. We know that quiz, you know, you might want to come back to, you might want to share it with your team. And when you come in, you've got personalized results. And these are the answers from basically your impact personality type quiz that we just coached you through. And what we first frame up, so I'll call it here, there is a worksheet that you can download so you can scribe your answers and take them with you outside of the tool. We first present to you a couple of impact goals, and each of these impact goals is framed as a narrative statement, and it is a combination of an adolescent development goal that comes from science with an entrepreneurial tactic, which comes from the business objectives that we used in step 1. Also comes from Digital Delta, same thing. So this result has 3 possible impact goals. And our idea here is that you as the user, you know your work best, and you can say which ones really resonate with you. You might take a combination of the results Impact Navigator presents. You might take a singular one with you. But each one is tagged with indicators that you can use to measure that goal. So for example, if your innovation, it feels really aligned with you that you're encouraging pro-social relationships through promoting a positive worldview. If that's the case, we'd recommend that you look at pro-social norms, moral competence, and pro-social opportunities to track changes and progress towards this goal. And that tagging system is a unique component to the Impact Navigator framework. The next idea is, so let's dig in and say, how do I actually measure moral competence? First, you can explore the definition that comes from science. Then you can see our review of the scale we're about to give you for this metric. We give you some caveats that are just important to know because the indicators we present here do come with limitations. And we want to be also building some capacity of folks who might not have as much evaluation, implementation experience to kind of understand what goes into conducting these kinds of experiments. Then we'll present a scale for each of these indicators. In future iterations, we might present multiple scales, but Impact Nav 1.0 just shows you one for each. And a scale is a bundle of survey questions that have been evidenced from a particular study. That study's citation is provided for you. There's also a bibliography in the resource section of the site, so you can actually go explore that study and see where it came from. But the idea is to measure moral competence, you would present these 6 questions to your young users with this Likert scale response. A point in time answer is interesting, but what's really interesting is how these changes, how answers to these change over time. That's when you can start understanding your innovation's contribution to this, right? Just deploying this, that's what we call baseline. You'll get a point in time count of where your users are at on moral competence right now. But in order to claim credit for any change in that and see if you're positively contributing to building their moral competence, you'd have to notice changes over time. Does that make sense on a scale? I'm sure a lot of folks in this room have experience with doing these kinds of things before. So I won't overly explain that right now, but I'm super happy to do so after the session or in another space. Again, each of these impact goals is tagged with a different combination of these indicators. I'll show you when we go back to the slide deck where these indicators came from and how they're tagged to the Digital Delta crowdsourced information. The idea here too is we'd be curious on how innovators might uniquely combine indicators that make sense for their innovation. These are all just recommendations, all just some guidance that we can give you, but perhaps, you know, social competence and bonding really make the most sense, and you might want to combine those with pro-social opportunities, something that's really speaking to you and reflecting your work. All right. We've got a lot in the chat. Thanks so much, everyone. It's really cool to see that you're all talking about the evidence-based measures and the scales and where they came from. I'm going to have a moment to show you that in just a second. And we'll talk a little bit more about positive youth development and the constructs that led to these indicators. Scotty, I might even invite you to share some of your ideas if you are keen to do that. Awesome. Before we talk more about positive youth development and the way we sourced these scales, I just want to show you a couple more aspects of the Impact Navigator site and the tool and how hopefully it's usable to you. So we just went through the results section. There's also this explore function, which is a way for you to see all the possible combinations of impact goals and indicators, both so you can understand the framework and maybe find something that's a better match. For example, maybe now that you're in this stage, you realize the way you answered the questions in the beginning could have been different. So you'll see here all 7 of those categories from step 1. And again, these are the dimensions of youth well-being that were reflected to us through the Digital Delta work. And then you can select an adolescent development outcome, which again come from social science research. We have 3 primary adolescent development goals. These 2 combine to create this impact goal, which again is a narrative statement and has been tagged with positive youth development indicators in that category. What I like about this Explore feature is that you can also see the objectives that we've tagged with this impact goal. So you can see what it might look like in a product, in a practice, and then what the impact measurement side looks like. I'll also just direct folks to the download full framework button, where you can get our entire comprehensive list of all of the indicators and all of the scales. So again, this is open source. We really welcome you to take this and use it in your own work. Last element of the tool that I'll demo for you is the resources page. And this is where we're featuring materials to support you on your implementation of these indicators. So like you've noticed, these scales we've provided are self-reported surveys that face your young users. So that requires folks to administer those surveys, track responses, and analyze data in your own systems, in your own tools, the stuff you're already using to communicate with your users. So you can read more about that and some of our recommendations for how to do that in this how-to guide. There's also these downloadables, the worksheet. You can also go explore Digital Delta from here. We've given you a couple of academic resources, which look like our bibliography, so you can find our source materials. You might also, perhaps you love the idea of measuring moral competence, but the questions in that scale don't really reflect your work. We welcome you to browse alternative scales and find some sets of survey questions that really nicely match your work and the population you're serving. Also really recommend this USAID Positive Youth Development Toolkit, which we used a lot as inspiration and source material for our framework. Also shout out to some of our partners and some other leaders in the impact measurement space. If there's other resources that you guys love and use in your work, please recommend them to us. We'd love to feature them on the resources page of the site. And I'll just again call out the leave feedback button. We really invite any questions, comments, ideas, things you'd like to see different to be logged there in the feedback button. Awesome. Thank you, Scotty, so much for answering so many of these questions in the chat. It looks like there's real appetite to dig in to understanding the positive youth development theories and what the metrics we've presented in the tool are. So I'm going to flip us over to talking specifically about that and show you a little bit about why we chose this. Anybody else have other questions about the impactnav.org site before we go back to talking a little bit about the science? Fabulous. Okay, so let's dig in under the hood. Like I said, youth are not living in a vacuum. We know this. So it was really important to us when we were sourcing an academic framework to match with the crowdsourced data that not only acknowledge this truth, but fundamentally designs for it. And so that's where positive youth development comes in. PYD is an academic framework, and it's a set of studies and approaches and constructs. It's quite a large field. I've learned so much about it with the help of Scotty. And what really excites me about it is that PYD accounts for both internal and external conditions and skills towards the ultimate goal of healthy, productive, and engaged youth. This means we're not only looking at young people as an individual, we're looking at the set of community conditions that that young person is in, including an enabling environment. This was also important to us in terms of matching Headstream's mission, because we know we're not solely focused on accelerating mental health interventions. We have quite a broad collection of innovations from education, health, and social technologies. So we needed to go beyond mental health frameworks, which we know are not only more complex, but a smaller slice of the interventions represented in Headstream. We also felt that positive youth development was a nice match for us, because if this is happening upstream, it's very likely that positive effects on mental health are happening downstream. So adolescent well-being is proximal and mental health is distal in this definition of success. Scotty, I'd love for you to chime in here. I think you really represent this perspective well on the dimensions of PYD that are well aligned with Headstream's ethos, values, and realities. And these are just the conditions that we pulled out as core to our selection process.
Sure. So hi, everyone. So what we wanted to do was really to, especially as a social worker, was operate from a strengths-based perspective and not looking at the deficits, because youth don't like that. They're like, why are you telling me how bad I am, or how I'm not functioning well? And it was like, no, we're going to show you how incredible you are. And the other part was, which I was putting in the chat, is that we also wanted to provide you all with evidence-based measures that can help show that you have done awesome work and can be used for grants, funding opportunities. I know a lot of you all are out there trying to get money to continue doing what you do. The flexibility of it was really based on understanding that adolescents are in different developmental stages. And so what I think is really helpful, or what would be really helpful, is to get from you all your perspectives on which scales work and which scales don't, because you would be the user and the people, and then you're going to be trying to help youth. And we all know that if youth don't like what they're hearing, or they don't like the way it feels when you ask them something, they're going to tell you. I'm not Gen Z, although I try to act cool, but what happens is they tell me you don't have it. And so there's flexibility also in co-design and being able to say, this is our starting point, now let's see where we go. The psychosocial was really building on what kind of skills can help youth achieve good outcomes down the road, like Megan was saying, the upstream and downstream, but also what are some protective factors that maybe organizations can use or companies can use to try to change that narrative, and being able to also incorporate what else is going on. The other thing that we think would happen in using these scales is that they show change, and innovators programs, because this does not have to be just online digital spaces, is that you would be able to look at dosage and be able to determine what parts of your program can be mapped to be able to address these. so that you have both a process and an outcome evaluation kind of built in. We also spent a lot of time developing implementation measures for, did this work, whenever they were designing it, and then that can then be used to understand, or to be able to take these into the community and help then assess in the best way possible. Because as Megan said, we're going to try to put in other measures and need some pilot data. And so anyway, to make sure that we did capture all of these things.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Scotty. And I'll just finish out this slide with sharing that we also chose PYD because it helped us mitigate some risks, which include things like confidentiality, working with minors, consent and ethics, the appropriateness of discussing mental health in some of the contexts we're working in, right? We're not in a medical setting. We can't be diagnosing folks. And also that we are meeting a DIY purpose. We're positioning folks to take these indicators and scales into their environment. And so we needed something that was broad enough to reflect that research methodology and the ethical constraints of the protocols that will be in practice there. So the way this looks in the tool, what you just saw, is the combination of objectives, which are our natural language, entrepreneurial facing language, with indicators, and those indicators come from Catalano's 15 PYD constructs. So in the tool, there are 15 possible indicators that are presented in 21 different combinations. And that's because we have 21 impact goals in the first iteration of Impact Navigator's framework. Again, an impact goal sounds like a narrative statement. So here's an example one, which is developing protective factors through a positive worldview. That was the one we saw in the tool as well. So that's one of 21 possible impact goals. And that one we present with 3 indicators in the site. And then each indicator is matched with one scale. And that scale in our presentation is between 5 and 10 survey questions that are built for self-reported answers directly from young users. So we present each of these in what we call a metric set. And then that metric set is designed to be taken offline outside of Impact Nav experience and put into your implementation systems so that you can track and measure your impact on that dimension. I mentioned we piloted this tool. We did that with Headstream's second cohort of 10 innovators, the awesome people who are in the demo day happening in the other track right now. And I'll really quickly share that we were super excited to practice what we preach and use an academic framework in assessing the effects of the pilot. And so with Scotty's guidance, we used what's called implementation science framework. So we were of course looking at if innovators were satisfied with the framework and the tool, but beyond that, we were really interested in learning how acceptable is this tool to you, how feasible is using this tool to you, and how desirable is using this tool for you. Really thrilled with the results that the first iteration is feasible and acceptable to innovators, an 81% composite score on both of those dimensions. And then we were also able to dig in on which aspects were the most contributing to that. And so 92% strongly agree that using Impact Navigator seems possible. This is exciting for me because it means that the current site brings the idea of the framework to life and gives us a lot of room to build it out and continue making it relevant and applicable. The innovators were also really deeply involved in designing this, in designing the tool itself. They gave us a lot of qualitative information about how to adjust it and how to design it so that it has maximum relevance and applications for them. And one thing that came up in these interviews that got me particularly excited was that the innovators found the metrics to be a good match for their work. That also scored very highly in the pilot. And some of their comments were around how this presents a different way of looking at their work. So for example, one innovator said that they never thought about the outcome of their anti-bias programming being moral competence, but seeing that as a core aspect of positive adolescent development made a lot of sense. And it was another lens through which they could articulate and understand their mission, which was super exciting. So the pilot positions us really well for what's next for Impact Navigator, which is first to make it easier to use. We know it's technical, we know it's text-based, and we're really excited to introduce more of an educational focus, make it more of a learning environment, and to improve its accessibility for different learning styles. Then we also really want to broaden its applications for other audiences, other stakeholders, and understand the effects of implementing the framework. We also see more ways we can meet the needs of investors, and we have some ideas around that. We'll also be really keen to build partnerships to extend its reach, put this in the hands of more practitioners, and to incorporate the learnings from Digital Delta around those catalytic factors. So the idea of Digital Delta and Impact Navigator speaking to each other more directly is really exciting for us. And then ultimately, we envision ways of replicating Impact Navigator and both building out its current methodology around youth well-being by including more scales, more constructs, more indicators, like some of you have mentioned in the chat, and then also learning more and more about how we approach this design challenge so that we can help other issue areas with impact measurement. So we only have a couple more minutes here. I'm sure there's lots of questions. In addition to hearing those questions you have, I want to pose one for the group, which is now that you've seen a little bit of Impact Navigator, I hope you're both inspired to test it out, give it a test run, give it a try, let us know how it works for you. But to also just take a moment to hear your reflections around the usability, desirability, acceptability of Impact Navigator for you. In what ways might you apply it to your work? What would it take for it to be even more relevant and useful to you? Do you have ideas about how we can proceed and where we could focus on from here? Let's see if there's any in the chat so far. Any questions? Any thoughts, any ideas? I know you're probably overstimulated from all of the programming happening today.
Amanda, can you explain a little bit more with what you mean by an integration with popular survey tools?
Sure. So, just thinking as like a user of these. So let's say I've gone in and I've pulled out, 5 scales that are for the impact measurements that I would really like to assess from the users of my product. So depending on how my product is built, I may not want to do that assessment within the product itself. I may want to take it off into a separate space. And so I'm just thinking things like SurveyMonkey, but there's other things like that. Mm-hmm. If there are ways to build it so that and maybe it already does this, I haven't had a chance to like really dig around, but if there are ways to even more seamlessly make it possible for harried, mm-hmm. Founders or others to pull these measures into other kinds of products that they could use to, send to lists that they already have of, or send out in other ways to people. Might make a way, just make it even easier for people to integrate this into their work.
Yeah, absolutely. Amanda, you're spot on. That's really a natural next step for us, is those integrations and making it really easy to put the findings into your practices. So I'd love to see that kind of plug into, like I mentioned, this was really a beta for us and was designed to make sure the framework resulted in meaningful evidence-based measures that innovators wanted, and felt reflective of their work. So we're so glad to have the green light to move forward from there. Thanks again. Yeah, we'll definitely incorporate that in our priorities. Is it Canon? I don't want to mispronounce your name. I see your hand raised.
Hi, it's Kanan. I actually wanted to make a further comment to what Amanda was already saying, is that if there were to be a way that now these questions can directly link to a tool, also then if organizations feel comfortable sharing the data as a result of using the tool, then it becomes a crowdsourced tool to also see, okay, what kind of impact are these tools able to demonstrate in different settings. So similar to, I guess, what you're trying to achieve with the other digital tool, which is more at the front end, this would be at the other end of
That's
that
right.
exercise.
That's exactly right. Yeah, thank you for that reflection. We're super aligned with that ambition, and I see that as a natural next step. And in the meantime, the way we're kind of meeting that crowdsource interest is in we're able to get the data on folks' impact goal results. So of course, we don't know which scales they'll actually take with them and implement in their work, but we will be able to observe, where people are organizing around shared impact goals, and that we do envision creating trend reports around and sharing with folks in the ecosystem and incorporating those lessons into all of our collective work. Another way we see that crowdsource approach gaining traction in future versions of the tool is around that that review feature. You might remember I moved over it fairly quickly, but we have a short review of the scale that we show you. So one thing we've envisioned is maybe we have multiple scales with community reviews of with what population they implemented that scale, how it went, or maybe phrasing that wasn't that relatable to their audience. Those types of implementation insights from the community would be so powerful. So we also envision some ways for there to be that comment feature in the marketplace of scales.
Cool. Thank you.
Carolyn, you just said about, yes, University of Wisconsin at Madison with Megan Moreno. Yes, I showed this to her a couple of weeks ago, and to Anne. So they're like, oh, wow. But yes, this leads very well to to giving organizations the tools so they don't have to go out and look for them, because it took me forever and Megan forever to find all these. It was like, holy moly, there's a lot out there, and there's some really bad scales. And so we kind of wanted to be an expert in a box, so that people didn't have to pay a consultant and to go out and find them, although that puts me out of my job when I'm doing my fun stuff outside of my academic world. The other thing is we wanted to make it to where you could look at different elements of your product or program, and you can roll it out. I mean, you can then look at relationships. Does this program make this impact? Or what's the relationship of different demographics, and how someone moves through your program or your product. Sorry, I do most program evaluation.
Wonderful. We've got just one more minute to go, so I'll quickly just thank you so much for your time and ideas. We are going to invite you to the next session happening on this room, which is inside the Youth Advisory Board. And I'll just again thank everybody on behalf of Impact Navigator I know Scotty put my email in the chat just a minute ago, and I'll again drop it in. We'd love to continue the conversation. We'd love to empower you to use Impact Navigator. We'd love to incorporate your feedback and thoughts as we grow this tool. And I'm really grateful for your time, for your generous listening, and your participation in this community. We really believe Impact Navigator is a reflection of all of you and all of your commitment to this space, and we're here to serve you and empower you to achieve those missions. So thank you for everything, and thanks for being a part of this.
Thank you. Thanks, Megan.
Thanks, Scotty, for jumping in as well.
Yep.
Thank you, Megan and Scotty. Really appreciate it. Just coming up next on the schedule, you all have a choice of 3 sessions. You can stay in this room and you can dive deep into the advisory board structure that we have. That it will be with 2 of the youth advisors, 1 of the innovators from the Headstream Accelerator, and their professional advisors. And then you will also have the opportunity to take a break if you'd like to with moving